All right, last week I had handed out lesson number 8, and so it was dated December the 12th, and so we want to finish up that document that I handed out last week. I think I got through about halfway, and so we first of all did a review. We did a review of the previous dispensation, that is the dispensation of human government, so that was the third dispensation. So we are doing a study on what on earth is God doing, what are God's plans for the ages. And so we reviewed 3 different dispensations or eras or epochs of time, and now we are discussing the dispensation of promise. Now, I've had to basically give you an overview of these dispensations, and now as we get into the later dispensations, we're going to have more and more revelation. But I want you to think back, even with respect to the age of promise that we're talking about now, how little information they had about who God is, right? When we come to the issue of Abraham, we talked about the fact that God met with him, I think it was 6 times, if I remember correctly. And I'm trying to remember where that was. Anyway, I know it's there, but I just can't see it quickly enough. But Abraham heard from God 6 times, but the information that God gave him was enough information for Abraham to have faith in God, but it was a far cry from what we know of God today because of the additional revelation that we have. And so he would have known that God is creator and that God is sovereign and God is working out his plan. And he would have known that about God's promise that we've been discussing here. But even as I talked about that was on the bottom of page 4, that he heard from God occasionally, once when he was 75 years old, and then a few times when he was, then twice shortly after that when he was 85 years old, and then a few times after that when he was 99 years old. So in the course of those 25 years, he heard from God 6 times. He lived after that period. I can't remember exactly how long he lived after that, but we don't have any information regarding any more revelation or any other times that God spoke to him. So out of that, let's say, from the time of his salvation, 75 years old, to the time that he died, I really wish I remembered how long he lived. I'm going to take a stab. I think somewhere around 140. Anyone know exactly off the top of your head? All right, somewhere around there. So 70 years of living by faith in God, and yet he had very little revelation about God and very little communication with God, and very little, as we would say, personal relationship with God. Certainly he could have prayed and things of that nature, right? Just like we can. But we have the added benefit of God's Word, so we can read God's Word, we can hear from Him in the sense that the Spirit works through the Bible and speaks to us, and then we can speak to God through prayer. But Abraham didn't have that blessing of being able to open up the Bible and read about God, know God, who He was, what His desires were. He only had that little bit of revelation that God had given him. And yet it was enough, as I mentioned earlier, for him to live by faith. And so we are living in a blessed day in that we have more revelation of God, and so we can have a better understanding of who God is. So we talked about the new revelation that God had given him. Number 1, to be a personal God. And so this promise went beyond salvation, right? He was already saved, but God was promising him that God would be his personal God, that there would be intimacy. And so I talked about the fact that he would have personal and unhindered fellowship with God. He had fellowship with God, but it was hindered. It was hindered because of a number of reasons, one of them being that he didn't have a lot of revelation about God, and also because of, if I can put it this way, distance. There was, in some sense, a separation between God and Abraham. Not in the sense of salvation, he was saved, but he was anticipating a time to be able to personally and immediately fellowship with God. See, even we don't immediately fellowship with God. We're saved through Jesus Christ, and we can pray to him and we can read his word, but it's not an immediate relationship, right? Because we can't see him, we can't hear him, and so we are anticipating as well a better time, right? The fulfillment of our salvation. And so when God said to Abraham that he was going to be a personal God to Abraham and his descendants, he wasn't talking about salvation. He was talking about the end goal of salvation. That is, to be in God's very presence and to fellowship with him. And the second promise was to make a great nation of Abraham's descendants. And again, both of these promises are going to be fulfilled in the future. And so when we talk about the descendants of Abraham also having a personal relationship with God, we are talking then about, now if we are talking about the Old Testament descendants of Abraham, they would have needed to be saved by faith, and they would have been saved by faith, and they will eventually have an immediate and personal relationship with God in the future. But if we're talking about now, and Israel now, and Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, entering into a right relationship with God now, that has to take place by faith, right? And so let me clarify that a little bit. So right now, if a Jew were to be saved, he would then become part of the church, and he would receive the blessings of being part of the church. But these promises that God has given to Abraham and his descendants have to do with those who are outside of the church. They would still need to be saved in order to experience these promises. So, for instance, once the church ends, and we enter into that, or I shouldn't say we, the earth enters into the tribulation period, there will be Jews, many Jews who are saved. How are they saved? By faith. But they will have to have a right relationship with Jesus Christ. In the Old Testament, they didn't understand about Jesus. I've mentioned that before. But yet they could be saved by faith. In the New Testament, after the advent of Jesus Christ, everyone needs a knowledge of Jesus Christ in order to be saved, Jew or Gentile. All right? And so following the advent of Christ, salvation is hinged upon a definite understanding of the Lord Jesus Christ as Savior. So we talked about those two promises that God gave. And we know that those promises will ultimately be fulfilled in the millennial kingdom. Number 3, is that where I left off last week? Okay, so we finished off, I finished that last paragraph on, the first paragraph on page 6. The last space was, that tells us it will take place in the future. Is that correct? All right, so point number 3. This is the third promise that God gave to Abraham. And the promise or the revelation that God gave to Abraham was a specific dwelling place. A specific dwelling place. That is, a land with specific borders. In other words, we're not to spiritualize this away. God made it very clear that he wanted to give them a specific land. You know, that land right now that they're fighting over in the Middle East, and wondering, who does that belong to? Do the Jews or the Palestinians? It belongs to Abraham and his descendants. All right. So reading the promise which God gave to Abraham leads the reader to significant conclusion if he's willing to take the above passages at face value. So I've given you a lot of different verses there. And so let me draw your attention to Genesis 13. Genesis 13. Genesis 13 begins by talking about how Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him to the south, and he was rich. And in verse 4 it says that he went to the place of the altar which he had made there at first, that was at Bethel and Ai, and there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Verse 5 says Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds. And then it talks about the fact that there was a lot of friction between Abraham and Lot because they had large herds, both of them had large herds, and the land, trying to stay together was difficult because the land did not support their large herds. And so in verse 9, this is what Abraham said to Lot. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left. So Abraham is being gracious here. He's giving Lot the choice to make as to where he would take his flocks and herds. And so they would separate themselves so that they could provide for their flocks and not cause friction between one another. And so in verse 10, it talks about the fact that Lot made his decision and he went to the plains around Sodom and Gomorrah because they were well watered. In other words, they would provide well for his flocks and herds. And so then it says that Lot left. And this is the significant part in verse 14. After Lot left, so you have to get it in your mind now, Abraham, in a sense, gave. All right, it's a little generous of a term, but he gave Lot the choice. You go where you want. Choose the area you want to live. Now look at what God says to Abraham. In verse 14, the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward, for all the land which you see I give to you. So it doesn't matter if Lot chose that area. I'm giving you everything. All right, and I'll define everything. Everything doesn't mean the whole earth, obviously. Verse 15, for all the land which you see I give to you and your descendants forever, and I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. And so let's pause there for a second. If you go to Genesis 15, and verse 18, on the same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants, I have given this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. The Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. That doesn't make sense to us. Verse 19 doesn't make sense. But what God is saying here is, I'm giving you all of the land that is presently occupied by all of these different nations. All right? And so God was pretty specific there. The land that I'm going to give you is from the river of Egypt, all the way to the Euphrates. And so I've given you a couple maps on pages 6 and 7. And unfortunately, though the maps don't show the river Euphrates, it's still north of the maps that I'm showing you. All right. And so the area which God promised to the nation of Israel is significant. And now that we understand the basic boundaries, the other boundary would have been the sea to the sea, or the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea and the Jordan. And so in your notes there, I said God promised Abraham and his descendants a specific plot of land. Now, a plot we usually think of in terms of a small plot. This is obviously a large plot. This land was clearly identified using definite landmarks. No one should miss this point. God's promises should not be taken in a figurative sense, since he clearly defined the borders for the nation. Various passages within the Old Testament give a fairly specific idea as to what land God intended for Abraham to have. The picture on the right gives a fairly accurate description, but as I've mentioned, the river Euphrates isn't even in these maps, and so maybe go home and use Google Earth or Google Maps to figure out how far north the Euphrates is from there, and you'll get a better sense. So the thing to note about the land which God promised Abraham is that the nation did not fully conquer this land during the days of Joshua and the judges. So God promised land, but we know when we read the book of Joshua and all his conquests, they didn't get everything. Furthermore, this land was never fully acquired during the days of King David and Solomon. So during Solomon's reign, the kingdom of Israel had reached its most extensive reach. I don't know if that's the right way of putting it. But yet, even under Solomon, the nation of Israel did not have all of the land that God had promised. I said here the map shows the extent of the land which they acquired. However, there are some things to note. Some land was not acquired, such as the land of the Philistines and Sidon, as well as the northern region. Number two, the land which they acquired was not retained. In other words, they lost it after Solomon. Some land never became their possession. They had military control over areas, but they did not actually possess and inhabit it. All right, and so even the areas that that King David conquered, they simply were the masters over that land in the sense that they had conquered those people, but those people were still in those areas and inhabiting the land. God promised the land to Abraham and his descendants. And so on the top of page 7, these points demonstrate that during Israel's most influential time, the nation had not received what God had promised Abraham. Okay? So the nation of Israel, I'm fast forwarding here because the nation of Israel obviously came from Abraham, but God promised to Abraham, I'm going to give you all of this land, to you and your descendants. And so the nation of Israel, and at the height of their kingdom, we find that they did not possess everything that God had promised them. And so what does that tell us? It still has to happen. Okay? It's not that God's changed his mind, even though now thousands of years have transpired. We're not to say, oh, well, I guess God changed his mind. No, we're to say, okay, well, God promised it, and God cannot lie, and therefore it must still come to pass. And so various passages in the Bible which took place after the reigns of David and Solomon clearly show that the people of Israel did not believe that they had acquired the land, and that they believed that God would still fulfill his promise as given to Abraham. And I want to just give you two examples of that. There are numerous examples, but let me give you two. Two notable passages. Isaiah 27, verse 12, which was written around 740 to 680 BC, and then Ezekiel 47, 13 to 20, which was written in 592 to 570 BC. The significance of these passages is that the first takes place during Israel's rebellious years, prior to the Babylonian captivity, and Ezekiel's passage takes place during the captivity. So one before the captivity, one during the captivity. That is, the nation was under God's covenant chastisement. God was, at this point in Israel's history, chastising the nation for their disobedience. They were supposed to live under the Mosaic law, which we'll talk about in the next dispensation. But they failed to do that, and therefore they were being chastened by God. And so I said here in your notes that the chastisement because of the disobedience to the Mosaic covenant, and yet God still promised that the Abrahamic covenant would be fulfilled. If you go into the latter prophets, you will still find that message that God is going to bless the nation of Israel based upon the promises that God gave to Abraham. And so it's significant. It's not at the height of the kingdom. It's at the spiritual lowest point of the kingdom, where people had apostatized and turned their backs on God, and yet God came to them through the prophets and said, I am still going to be gracious to Abraham's descendants because of my promise that I have given to Abraham. That's pretty significant. Why is that significant? Because, again, there are some theologians that say, well, basically the church takes Israel's place, and all of the promises that Israel was given are transferred to the church. But we clearly see in the height of their disobedience, that should be where God's message is, all right, you blew it. You're toast. I'm no longer going to give you any hope. But he gave them hope. He gave them a lot of hope that they would still have those promises. Not the church, but the nation of Israel. All right? And so these passages and others assured Israel that Abraham's descendants will inherit the land which God had promised them. And clearly in the days of Jesus, the nation of Israel still believed that God would fulfill his promises in the future. I'll talk about that in a moment here. As Ezekiel's passage shows on the top of page 8, this will occur during the millennial kingdom. So when will God finally fulfill that promise that he gave way back to Abraham? In the millennial kingdom. All right, and so those Jews, again, we have to kind of split up now Abraham's descendants. It's not to all descendants, it's to the descendants of faith. To the Old Testament saints, they are saved by faith, and they are going to inherit these promises. Following the church age, it will be to those who are of faith, Abraham's descendants, but their faith will have to be exercised based upon the additional revelation that God has given, and that is through Jesus Christ. They will need to receive Jesus Christ as their Savior during the tribulation period. Those who are saved during the tribulation period will enter into the kingdom, and they will receive those promises that God gave to Abraham along with the Old Testament saints. Okay? And so, in the New Testament, the coming of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, was understood to be the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham. However, this does not mean that we spiritualize God's promises and take away the literal meaning of God's promise to Abraham. What it does mean is that Jesus Christ is the one through whom the promises would ultimately be fulfilled. So we talked about the millennial kingdom. Christ will establish his kingdom on the earth. And I'll ask the question, what will the borders be? Well, they will be exactly as God has promised in the Old Testament, from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates, and from the Mediterranean to the Jordan. So Mary recognized that the coming of Jesus Christ was for the purpose of fulfilling the promise which God, notice this, Luke 1:55, spoke to our fathers, to Abraham and his descendants forever. So even in Jesus' day, some Jews had faith in God, like Mary did, and understood the coming of Jesus was somehow related to the promise that God had given to Abraham and his descendants forever. Now, I said it in that kind of ambiguous form because obviously in Luke chapter 1 here, Mary was limited in her understanding, right? She had to wrestle with, who is this infant going to be? He is from God. But she had to come to grips with the issue of, and it does seem like she understood right away that he was Messiah, but to understand that he was God was another issue that she needed to work out in her life, as the disciples in the New Testament bear witness of. So furthermore, Zechariah also expected. Zechariah, this is a prophet who is mentioned in the New Testament, in the Gospels, and so he also expected God to fulfill his promises to Abraham and his descendants. So notice Luke 1:70-75. As he spoke, so this is Zechariah saying, as he spoke, by the mouth of his holy prophets, who have been since the world began, that we should be saved from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us, to perform the mercy promised to our fathers, and to remember his holy covenant, the oath which he swore to our father Abraham, to grant us that we, being delivered from the hand of our enemies, might serve him without fear in holiness and righteousness before him all the days of our life. Do you see how he is still anticipating the promises of God, being with God, experiencing those promises, and having a more immediate relationship with God than what he had at the time he spoke this. So he understood the coming of Christ was somehow related to the fulfillment of the promises. That doesn't mean that when Jesus came, bang, those promises were fulfilled. That means Jesus was the fulfillment. He would bring them in to pass in his right time. And so on the bottom of page 8, notice the anticipation that the people would, notice that the anticipation was that the people would live in a time characterized by peace. That hasn't come to pass, has it? We're still experiencing wars. Israel as a nation has never experienced that time of peace. And righteousness, well, they've never experienced that on earth. And we have never experienced God ruling in righteousness on the earth. And so though this again points to the fact that God's promises to Abraham have not been fulfilled, and since a literal interpretation makes sense, God still plans on blessing Abraham and his descendants by giving them a land with specific borders, free from the threat of enemies, where God himself will dwell and rule in righteousness. And that obviously, as I said in your notes, takes place in the millennial kingdom. Okay, before I continue, do you have any questions about that? Okay, so let's continue on and talk about the fourth revelation that Abraham received from God. And that was that God would bless Abraham and the world. the last blessing mentioned to Abraham is first of all mentioned in Genesis 12 and verse 2. And there in verse 2, he said, "Go to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And so this last blessing mentioned to Abraham was that of a blessing the entire world through Abraham. And so when I say the entire world, I'm not saying the entire world without distinction, that everyone's going to be saved. The blessing has to do with salvation, but obviously it is not only to Abraham and his descendants, but to all of the world. But again, it doesn't mean that all of his descendants will be saved, nor does it mean that all of the world will be saved through Abraham. And so this is a reference to the coming of Jesus Christ, Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Judah, to David, to Christ. And the entire world has the potential of being blessed through this covenant. However, the actual fulfillment of the blessing is given to all, that is Jew or Gentile, as they respond as Abraham did in faith to God's promises. So again, it's a blessing of salvation. That blessing of salvation comes through faith. And so we know that God will save and has saved people by faith in the past, Abraham's descendants, etc., and he will do so, and he is doing that in the present as well as in the future. And so as we get through these dispensations, you'll see how that unfolds. All right, let's talk about the responsibility of man. I notice my time is running out, and I have still a few pages to go, so I may not actually finish this document. So the responsibility of man. What did they need to do? What did earth dwellers need to do during this time of promise? Those who wanted to be rightly related to God during this dispensation would need to do certain things. One, they needed to believe God's promises of the Abrahamic covenant. So regardless of where they lived on the earth, they needed to believe that God was going to bless Abraham. Number two, they needed to receive the rite of circumcision by faith. See, again, it goes back to what the question we had prior to the discovery class starting this morning. There are a lot of rituals in the Old Testament that God gave, depending on what dispensation we're talking about, but responsibilities that God has given. But God has always expected man to do those things by faith. If they have faith, they will obey God. There could have been people that would have just gone through the motions, but because of their lack of faith, going through the motion of that ritual would not have benefited them. So they needed to receive the rite of circumcision by faith. And so when I say they needed to receive, that's obviously Abraham's children, right? His descendants needed to receive the rite of circumcision. That was a ritual that distinguished the nation of Israel. They needed to live separated from the nations. Again, this is talking about Abraham's descendants, that is, and eventually, obviously, the nation of Israel. They needed to live separated from the nations, to recognize that the nations around them were heathens, pagans. They didn't believe in the one true God, and they needed to live separated lives. And then they needed to, number 4, remain in the land of promise. They needed to remain in the land of promise. And so looking at those responsibilities, again, we have to look at them and say, wow, they really didn't have a long list of responsibilities from God. Just 4 things, other than obviously the continuing principles from the previous dispensations, but not a lot. But yet there was still failure in that dispensation, and let's talk about that. Failure occurred on 2 levels, personally and nationally. Personal failure can be seen in the lives of the patriarchs. These examples were unusual and not the norm. For instance, Abraham faltered in his faith twice when drought occurred and he went into Egypt and Gerar. Okay, so Abraham failed in his faith. That doesn't mean that Abraham lost his faith. That doesn't mean that Abraham wasn't saved by faith. He had faith. The Bible assures us of that, and that he was justified by faith. But there were some instances in his life where his faith faltered. We can identify, right? Because there are times in our lives where our faith falters. Doesn't mean we're not saved. Doesn't mean we all of a sudden lost our salvation. But we had a momentary lapse in our faith, which caused disobedience. All right, and so on both occasions, he lied about Sarah's identity in order to keep himself from harm. So he lied about Sarah. Oh, she's my sister. Why? Because he figured that he was safer doing that than saying, she's my wife, and then have the king chop his head off because he wanted Sarah himself. So Abraham also failed when he took Hagar in order to produce offspring, and then when he tried to convince God to bless through Ishmael. So he went ahead of God and said, here, God, I can help you out here. You said my descendants, okay? Well, here is a descendant from Hagar. Now you're going to bless me through Ishmael. And God said, no. All right. So again, confirming that idea of faith. He faltered, yes. But his responsibility was to trust God. He was going to give him a nation. And so, think about it. If you're childless, and God says, I'm going to give you a nation, I'm going to bless you and your descendants, then faith says, okay, well, if he's going to bless my descendants, that means he has to give me a son. So faith would say, I have to wait. I have to be patient. And that's what we don't like, right? We don't like being patient. We want things to happen on our terms, in our time frame. And so Abraham was no different, and he said, okay, here I am. It obviously looks like Sarah is having problems, and so I'll get Hagar and I'll hasten the process. And that is an issue where he faltered in his faith. Personal failure was also demonstrated in the life of Isaac, Abraham's son, who also faltered in his faith and began to travel to Egypt during a famine, but ended up in Gerar. As a result, he too lied about his wife Rebekah. On page 10, failure was also demonstrated in the life of Jacob when he lied and pretended to be Esau in order to steal Esau's blessing. All right, all 3 of those men were men of faith. That is, they were justified by faith. They had a saving relationship with God, but their faith faltered. All right. After that, it gets more challenging to identify the individuals of faith in the Old Testament. And so we see additional failure in the lives of the descendants of Abraham. Failure may also be seen on a national level in the form of 75 children of Jacob. So I say national here. You take it with a grain of salt because obviously they weren't a nation at that point. So we see 75 children of Jacob entering Egypt during the time of famine. And so some people would question, well, was that a lack of faith? And so I have dealt with that on page 10. Viewing the sojourn in Egypt as a result of corporate failure might be a little hard for us to understand for a number of reasons. Number one, God told Abraham that his descendants would live in Egypt for 400 years. That is found in Genesis 15:13. Sorry, I think I've got some problems here with the text here. I think this is, okay, sorry, I didn't see that. And then number 2, pardon me. By faith, Joseph said that his capture, his imprisonment, and subsequent ascendancy in Egypt was for the purpose of preserving the nation of Israel. And number 3, God appeared to Jacob and seems to have allowed him to go into Egypt. So those 3 things would say, well, how can we say that their time in Egypt was failure when God said that they would go and Joseph said the nation would be founded, that all of the events happened in order for God to create a nation in Egypt? And number 3, God appeared to Jacob and seemed to have allowed him to go into Egypt. And so here is how I respond to that. The above objections to viewing the 403-year sojourn in Egypt as a failure can be countered by the following. First, because God told Abraham what would happen, that his descendants would live in Egypt for 400 years, does not mean that this was God's perfect will. It simply reflects that God knew their choices and that he would allow them to make poor choices, therefore his permissive will. Second, Joseph was in Egypt to help preserve Israel. When God allowed him to rule after 13 years in prison, he spent 7 years collecting food for the following 7 years of famine, so 14 years total. This food would feed not only Egypt, but the outlying countries, including Jacob and his family. The first 27 years which Joseph spent in Egypt to supply for the nation of Israel hardly justifies the remaining 425 years, which Israel spent in Egypt. Last objection regarding God's allowance for Jacob to travel to Egypt is the hardest to overcome. In Genesis 46, verses 1 to 5, God appeared to Jacob as he was on his way to Egypt, having heard that Joseph was still alive. And so in verse 3, God told Jacob not to be afraid, to go down to Egypt, because it was there that he would make a great nation out of Jacob's children. Rather than rebuking Jacob, God seemed to encourage Jacob to go to Egypt, and the language seems to allow for a substantially long period of time. First, the thing that we have to realize is that Jacob lived in the land of Canaan, probably around Shechem. In Genesis 46:1, we find that God appeared to him in Beersheba on the southerly border of the land of Canaan, almost 80 miles away from Shechem. In other words, Jacob had already traveled a significant distance before God spoke to him. Furthermore, years earlier, God specifically commanded Jacob's father Isaac not to go down to Egypt. Jacob was still at home when this occurred and would have known about this command. Secondly, they were supposed to live by faith. If God had promised to give them the land and warned them not to leave the land, then surely he would have been able to provide for them during the time of famine. And thirdly, while in Egypt, Israel became largely apostate and remained so during the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. You know, we have this in our minds that the nation of Israel was God's people, and they were God's people, but that doesn't mean that they were saved, and that they had a right relationship with God, and that they worshiped God correctly. That was the whole point of God taking them out of Egypt. They were reprobates, and then God took them to the mount, all of a sudden it has escaped my brain, where God gave the nation of Israel his law, and that law was to show them how to have a right relationship with God. So they were reprobate, they were away from God, and God was bringing them to himself. And so the point is that if they had been walking by faith in the first place, Egypt would not have been necessary. And so there was judgment at the end of this particular dispensation. Genesis 34 to 50 talks about judgment as a result of their failures, and it records life prior to entering Egypt. It shows that Jacob's sons were spiritual losers. You know, unbelievers often remark that the Bible is filled with sinful people. Yeah, that's right. That doesn't mean that the Bible is not true. It doesn't mean that God didn't write his word, because there are many sinful people being recorded in the Bible. It demonstrates that what God said is true, that man is a sinner, and he continually sins and goes away from God. So the judgment of the dispensation of promise was the Egyptian bondage. So it wasn't God's will for them, his perfect will for them to go into Egypt. It was his permissive will, and in fact, the Egyptian bondage was their judgment. So there were continuing principles from this dispensation that lasted after this dispensation concluded. The only continuing principle from this dispensation is the necessity to believe in God's promise to Abraham. That hope became ingrained in the nation of Israel as the Gospels reveal. Even in the Gospel records, they are anticipating that God will fulfill his promise to Abraham. In other words, it had not been fulfilled in the Old Testament, and they were expecting it to be fulfilled in the future through the coming of the Messiah.